Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for joining us, and while you're with us, please take a moment to subscribe below and don't forget to hit that bell symbol for notification. Considering the enormous influence George Orwell has had on the Western political dialectic, it is surprising so little information is available about this most unextraordinary man who has had such an extraordinary effect on how so many of us view state control and state power and its exercising. We will try and condense the essential life and times of this literary giant in 10 minutes, so please stay to the end or come back later if you're pressed for time right now. It is difficult to imagine a gangly 190 centimetre tall man that's about 6'3", with almost perpetual poor respiratory health. He was shy, romantically awkward around women up until his death, racked by self-doubt and uncertainty, often taken to bouts of virtual self-flagellation, and ultimately was an ordinary student in many ways. Yet this person would later become an author and political commentator of enduring international renown. Born Eric Arthur Blair in India during 1903, his nom de plume or pen name of George Orwell was still nearly 30 years away, or so into the future. Now, young George was born and lived in India for his early childhood. His father, who had married late in life to a much younger woman, was an upper middle-ranking public servant in the British Empire, or the British India Agricultural Department as it was then known, before two exhausting world wars took and reduced Britain from being a world power to a power of the second rank. George, accompanied by his mother and sisters, went from India to England to begin their education, the father staying on in India because of his job. This was a practice that was quite customary at the time for British public servants with overseas postings to send their children back to England for an education. George's mother was an independent woman of artistic tastes and something of an aspiring socialite, a trait also evident in one of George's sisters, who later became a successful independent business owner. George, meanwhile, was packed off to boarding school as soon as a suitable and affordable school could be found. Young George had shown early promise as a student, and keen to chase the potential bragging rights of having a star student or educating a potential star student, George was schooled for about half the standard tuition rate of this particular school, which included, of course, boarding fees. This arrangement, George believed at least, placed him under a great deal of pressure to perform academically, an observation suggesting he did not deal well with the strains of having this responsibility on his shoulders. The memories of early school and later high school were for the most part unpleasant for George, and some aspects he was later to recall with near bitterness. He observed, for example, the wife of the headmaster, who also taught French, bullied and constantly harassed her husband and basically ran the school, showing a vindictive streak that George was allegedly on the receiving end of. The character traits of introspection, aloofness, the outsider observing but never really participating or joining in were already in evidence before George was even a teenager. Were these invaluable, if not essential, formative influences and methods of reasoning in the lines of, say, Descartes, or analysis, a capacity for analysis that can produce a writer that in turn has the capacity to create such works as 1984? Without such influences and attitudes and views, could 1984 ever have been conceived, let alone written? Partly through family influences, and also because Burma, or modern Myanmar, which is located east of India and south of China, was one of the most dangerous places in the British Empire. A barely post-pubescent George joined the British Empire Colonial Section Police. It was a job that few people wanted, and although he just scraped through on the public service exam and badly flunked the horse riding practical exam, which was important for the Empire outposts, George nonetheless had an ear for languages, which was a priority in the Colonial Department, so he gained a probationary position in Burma. Burma was a generally lawless frontier of the British Empire and very expensive to police, given the difficult terrain, the vast area, and the intense and long-lasting monsoon season. The native-on-native brown murders and torturings were so numerous that the colonial police, which was a handful of Europeans supported by a bevy of native recruits, was rarely, if ever, able to take firm and continuous control of the territory. Even so, the area or parts of it were important to Britain, not least because of the petroleum processing plants that were located there. Against an already murderous backdrop, well before the British arrived, along with the confusion and endless turmoil, the precise role of power and indeed justice was often meted out inconsistently and at times arbitrarily, an unpleasant reality that upset the conscience of a young, recent convert to socialism and a very impressionable and lonely young man stuck in the farthest outposts of empire. The later contracting of tuberculosis while there only added to his seeming isolation. Much to the concern of his family, Orwell quit the Colonial Police Department and the public service altogether shortly after returning to England via Paris when he was on sick leave. Staying at the family home, he got by with part-time teaching and tutoring jobs, and even worked in a bookshop at one stage. Later, Orwell went to Spain during the Spanish Civil War in support of the communist side. During the 1920s and 30s, literary success was any book that sold more than 3,000 copies in England or more than 10,000 copies in the United States. So if a book sold more than 5,000 copies in England, it was placed or put the author in a position of being almost a budding superstar. Orwell's early work were very much a lost soul seeking meaning from and trying to understand life and the limits of power, political power, state power in general. Ostensibly to find raw literary material for writing, Orwell even dressed as a tramp and went to live on the streets, often for weeks at a time, hanging out with groups of vagabonds. This demonstrates Orwell's forming vision that if one was not well-to-do and actively chose to give away their dignity and suffer self-inflicted humiliation, then they were safe from additional harm as they had neither money nor dignity that could be taken from them by the state. This nexus is critical to understanding Orwell's depiction of the nature of power and the power Big Brother has over the subjugated populace. Big Brother wanted to take something even more than dignity, the power to enforce treacherous deception and the humiliation of being forced to say 3 is actually 4. And this was the essence of the unspeakable evil that Orwell later sought to warn us about. Some of Orwell's early work, which emphasised the social rather than the political, achieved sufficient success for him to be recognised as a player in the literary space. Down and Out in London and Paris, as an example, is perhaps Orwell's best-known early foray into writing. Once known as a writer, even of middling repute, entrance was gained into the more lucrative and cash-flow consistent end of the writing game as a writer of magazine articles and a titled reviewer of other writers' published works. Animal Farm was published in late 1945 or during 1946 in the United States, and it was Orwell writing euphemistically about his disenchantment with the statist and Stalinist version of the Russian Bolshevik People's Revolution and that regime's chronic abuse of power and murdering many millions of their citizens for wrongthink. Communist Party leaders and enforcer goons ate the very best caviar, drank the very best vodka, watched Western movies, while the masses just got by. The Russians had simply replaced one oppressive ruling class for another, which Orwell noted was somehow the way of revolutions when conducted without the consent of the governed. Hoping for book sales between, say, 2,000 to 3,000 and still mourning following the death of his wife Eileen earlier in the year, Orwell was shocked to see how well Animal Farm sold. Its success established him as one of the leading literary figures in this political genre. Events conspired to make Animal Farm a poignant message of its times, as the communist Soviet Union openly broke with the Western powers, which had been its allies during World War II. Orwell's seminal and final work, 1984, was published in mid-1949 to huge critical acclaim, particularly given the times of, again, the Cold War backdrop, the Soviet Union exploding atomic bombs and so on, an acclaim which has continued to the present day. It has been made into TV and cinema movies, it has been serialised in numerous magazines and poured over an endless array of times in various biographies and so on. Barely 6 months after publication of 1984, Orwell was dead, and yet he was already immortal, dying in January 1950. Orwell left a message that resonates, and in these times of forced globalisation against the will of the people, supported by a torrent of propaganda, Orwell's message, and this is a message that bellows down through the years to this very day. As Winston Smith says to his torturer in the movie 1984, who rejoices in the belief the population has been deceived and humiliated while gorging on the sheer scope of the treachery inflicted. And you can see the link below. And a tortured Winston Smith says, in the end, they, the people, will beat you. In the end, they will tear you to pieces. You've been with Tacitus today at Your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.